Mark Davis stepped off the sleek, white transport shuttle, his boots making a hollow thud against the landing platform of Elysium Haven. The floating resort hung suspended among soft, cloud-like formations, an artificial paradise far above the bustling earth below. Above him, the sky shifted in a gradient of pinks and purples, blending into the deeper hues of the setting sun. The air was impossibly clean, fragrant with the delicate scent of exotic flora that filled the landscaped gardens bordering the platform. He inhaled deeply, savoring the faint sweetness of the alien plants. It was a far cry from the grime and tension of his recent missions. The resort gleamed in the distance, a collection of crystalline towers and curving structures that seemed to float effortlessly in the air. Transparent walkways, glowing faintly with soft lights, stretched between the buildings like bridges to nowhere. It was the kind of place meant to offer peace, relaxation, and luxury to its guests, everything Mark had been deprived of for too long. But despite its beauty, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled in his gut. His instincts, honed through years of covert operations, told him that such places rarely offered true peace, though a soft chime sounded near him, drawing his attention. "Welcome to Elysium Haven, Mr. Davis," a voice said. He turned to find a holographic greeter hovering beside him, its translucent form flickering slightly in the ambient light. The figure had the appearance of a woman, though her features were soft and vaguely artificial, meant to be soothing. He soothed. "Your biometrics have been confirmed and your reservation is ready. Please proceed to the main reception for check-in." Mark gave a short nod, shouldering the small duffel bag he carried. He was traveling light, always ready to move quickly if necessary. The hologram disappeared as he made his way toward the main resort building, his boots echoing faintly on the polished surface of the platform. As he walked, his sharp eyes took in the details around him. Guests of all shapes and forms moved leisurely across the floating paths that connected the towers, their alien bodies and humanoid figures alike bathed in the glow of the setting sun. Some were familiar species, others not so much. A towering figure with silver scales glided past him, its elongated limbs graceful in their movements. Nearby, a couple strolled arm in arm, one of them possessing multiple shimmering, iridescent arms, while the other's skin seemed to ripple like water under the sunlight. The air thrummed with life, yet none of it felt familiar. It was a reminder that this place, however beautiful, was far from ordinary. Ahead, the main entrance to the resort beckoned, its facade a masterpiece of modern design. The crystalline structure refracted light in every direction, creating a kaleidoscope effect that made the entire building seem to pulse with color. It felt both ethereal and unreal, like stepping into a dream. Mark's fingers twitched unconsciously toward his side, where he would normally carry a weapon. But here, at this luxurious retreat, he was unarmed. It was meant to be a break from the chaos, a place where no one would be looking for him, where his past wouldn't follow. But old habits die hard. He walked with practiced precision, every step calculated, his senses alert despite the serene surroundings. His gaze flicked to the corners of the walkway, noting the subtle placements of security drones hovering in the shadows, their presence barely noticeable unless one knew what to look for. But Mark had spent his life being aware of his surroundings, and that awareness didn't vanish simply because he was on a so-called vacation. As he neared the entrance, a gentle breeze rolled over him, carrying with it the scent of freshly bloomed flowers. He paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the perfectly manicured gardens that flanked the path. Strange, otherworldly blossoms spread their petals wide, their colors so vibrant they seemed to hume with energy. Their scent was intoxicating, calming even, but it also felt foreign, like everything else here. He resisted the urge to step closer to examine the flowers more thoroughly. There was always something to analyze, always something to investigate, but today wasn't the time for it. Today was meant for relaxation, though his body resisted the very idea. As he reached the grand entrance, a silent sliding door opened, revealing a cool, expansive lobby within. The interior was as breathtaking as the exterior. High, vaulted ceilings stretched above, made entirely of transparent material that allowed a view of the sky outside. Then the ambient lighting bathed the space in a warm, inviting glow. Waterfalls of liquid silver cascaded down one side of the room, filling the air with a gentle, melodic sound that mixed with the hum of distant conversations. The floors were smooth, polished stone, reflecting the sparkling chandelier-like structures that floated just beneath the ceiling. It was a vision of serenity, of perfection, and yet Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was out of place, though he couldn't say what. His eyes swept across the room, registering everything in quick succession. No immediate threats, no signs of danger, just the rhythmic, peaceful movements of guests enjoying their time here. He approached the reception desk, where an attendant stood waiting, a pleasant smile plastered across their face. "Mr. Davis, we're delighted to welcome you to Elysium Haven," the attendant said, his blue-tinted skin glowing faintly under the lights. "Your suite is ready, and I see you've booked one of our premium massage packages with Zara. She's our most highly requested masseuse. You're in for a treat." Mark nodded curtly, offering nothing more than a brief thank you before moving to collect his room key. He hadn't come here for the luxuries or the pampering. He needed solitude, a space to decompress, and to regain his mental clarity. Yet even as the attendant's words echoed in his mind, he felt the slightest twinge of curiosity about Zara, the masseuse everyone seemed so eager to recommend. He brushed the thought away quickly, forcing himself to focus on the present. There would be time for distractions later. Key in hand, Mark made his way toward the elevators, passing through the quiet bustle of the lobby. As he entered the lift, its doors sliding shut behind him, he caught his own reflection in the mirrored walls. His face was calm, unreadable, though the tension in his jaw betrayed the restlessness beneath the surface. His short cropped hair and the sharp angles of his features gave him the look of someone who was always on edge, always preparing for something that never quite arrived. The elevator ascended smoothly, the floors blinking by in a gentle progression. Mark shifted his weight slightly, feeling the press of fatigue in his muscles. The adrenaline from his last mission had long since worn off, leaving behind only exhaustion. He'd chosen this place because it was discreet, far removed from the chaos of his work. Elysium Haven was known for its privacy and top-tier security, both qualities that had drawn him here. Yet even now, he couldn't fully let his guard down. Elevator dinged softly, and the doors slid open to reveal a corridor lined with doors, each leading to a suite more extravagant than the last. Mark strode down the hallway, the plush carpet muffling his footsteps. His suite was near the end, and as he reached the door, it opened with a soft hiss, revealing a space that was nothing short of opulent. The room itself was a marvel of modern design, minimalist yet luxurious, with sweeping views of the clouds outside. A massive bed dominated the center, its linen smooth and inviting. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the far wall, offering an unobstructed view of the sky, where the last rays of sunlight were now fading into dusk. The soft, ambient lighting cast a warm glow over everything, making the space feel calm, almost surreal. Mark dropped his bag by the door and took a moment to survey the room. His eyes moved over the furniture, the art on the walls, the subtle touches of luxury that most would find comforting. But comfort wasn't what he sought. His instincts told him to sweep the room for bugs, to check for hidden surveillance, old habits that had become second-nature. He resisted the urge, though it took considerable effort. Finally, he moved to the window, letting his gaze drift over the horizon. The distant glow of the setting sun cast long shadows across the clouds, painting the sky in shades of pink, orange, and deep violet. It was beautiful in a way he hadn't expected, and for a moment, Mark allowed himself to feel something other than vigilance. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the glass slightly before disappearing. Maybe this place could offer him a reprieve, after all, a place where he could let go, if only for a short while. Yet even as the thought crossed his mind, the faint hum of tension in his muscles remained. Relaxation, it seemed, would not come easily. Mark Davis stood before the ornate entrance to the spa, feeling the weight of the atmosphere shift around him. The corridor leading into the treatment area was bathed in soft, ambient light that seemed to pulse gently in time with his heartbeat. It was the kind of space designed to lull guests into a state of relaxation before they even entered the massage room, soothing and pristine. But Mark wasn't easily soothed. The spa attendant, a humanoid with pale, opalescent skin and elongated, delicate fingers, gave him a nod of acknowledgement as they ushered him toward the private room. The door slid open with a faint whisper, revealing a tranquil chamber illuminated by a gentle blue glow. The air inside was thick with the scent of unfamiliar herbs, rich, floral, and slightly musky. It was an atmosphere engineered to calm, but Mark felt a strange sense of anticipation that cut through the intended serenity. He stepped inside, the door sliding shut behind him, sealing him in with the quiet hum of the room's hidden technology. Everything felt sterile, perfect, controlled. The floor beneath his feet was made of smooth, dark stone, cool against his bare soles as he walked further into the room. A massage table dominated the center of the space, its surface draped with soft white linens that seemed to glow under the low light. Mark's eyes darted instinctively around the room, scanning it with the practiced precision of someone used to assessing threats, even the most unlikely of places. There were no obvious signs of danger, no suspicious anomalies, just a quiet, luxurious space designed for comfort. And yet, his body remained tense, his muscles coiled tight beneath the thin rope he had been given. The soft sound, almost imperceptible, drew his attention to the far side of the room. The door that led to an adjoining chamber slid open with the same whisper-quiet efficiency, and she entered. Zara. Her presence seemed to fill the room instantly, though she moved with a grace that made no sound. Mark's eyes were drawn to her immediately, and the sight of her made his breath catch in his throat. She was like nothing he had ever seen before, even with all the alien species he had encountered during his years of service. Her skin was a deep, shimmering violet, as though someone had poured liquid starlight across her body. Every movement she made seemed to cause her skin to shift and ripple, catching the light in ways that felt almost hypnotic. But it wasn't just her skin that held his attention. It was the way she carried herself, the subtle confidence in her stride, the quiet intensity in her gaze. Her eyes, large and almond-shaped, were the color of molten gold, and they locked onto Mark's with a kind of knowing that made his pulse quicken. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at him, like she could see more than what was on the surface, like she could see through him. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Mark felt the faintest flicker of heat at the base of his neck, an almost imperceptible prickle of awareness that spread across his skin. He didn't understand it, but he didn't have time to process the sensation before Zara moved toward him, her steps soundless on the stone floor. She was tall, her lithe frame accentuated by the simple, flowing garments she wore, garments that seemed to cling to her body in ways that defied gravity. Mark's eyes traced the curve of her shoulders, the way her hips swayed with each step, but his focus quickly shifted back to her face. Her expression was calm, composed, but there was a heat in her eyes that betrayed something deeper, something. Without a word, she gestured for him to lie down on the massage table. Her movements were fluid, as though the air itself parted for her, and Mark found himself obeying without question, though his instinct screamed for caution. He slipped off his robe and stretched out on the table, his body tense beneath the thin towel that now covered him. His muscles were tight from years of combat and covert missions, and though he had booked his session to relax, his mind was anything but. Zara moved closer, standing beside him now, her hands hovering just above his back. He couldn't see her from where he lay, but he could feel her presence, feel the slight change in the air around him as her hands came nearer to his skin. For a moment, she didn't touch him. Instead, her fingers hovered inches above his bare back, and Mark felt the strangest sensation pass through him. It was as though the space between her hands and his skin was charged with an invisible energy, something that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. Then, slowly, her hands descended. The first touch was barely a touch at all, more like a breath of wind brushing against his skin. Yet, it sent a jolt through his entire body. Zara's fingers were impossibly soft, almost ethereal, as though they were not fully of this world. But there was a power in her touch, a depth of control that Mark had never experienced before. It was as if she knew exactly where to press, exactly where his body carried the weight of his tension, the years of strain buried deep in his muscles. Her hands glided over his back, tracing the curve of his spine, and Mark could feel his body respond in ways he hadn't expected. There was an undercurrent to her movements, something electric and raw that stirred in his core. Each press of her fingers seemed to unlock something within him, not just in his body, but in his mind. He could feel his thoughts growing hazy, the sharp edges of his awareness beginning to blur. Zara's touch deepened, and Mark found himself surrendering to it despite his instincts. Her hands moved with precision, kneading the knots of tension in his shoulders, tracing the hardened muscles along his back. Each motion sent waves of relief through his body, but there was something more. It wasn't just the physical sensation, there was an energy to it, something that pulsed beneath the surface. As she worked, Mark's breathing slowed, his mind drifting further away from the rigid control he usually maintained. Strange energy that had prickled his skin earlier seemed to grow stronger now, spreading through his body with each stroke of her hands. It wasn't painful, but it was intense, like a low, steady hum vibrating beneath his skin, awakening every nerve. He wasn't sure how long he lay there, his body slowly unwinding beneath Zara's touch. Time seemed to stretch, the moments blending together in a haze of sensation. The world outside the room felt distant, irrelevant. All that existed was the steady rhythm of her hands, the heat of her skin against his, and the strange, growing connection that pulsed between them. At some point, Mark became aware of Zara's breathing. It had changed, grown heavier, more labored. Her movements, too, seemed less controlled now, her hands trembling slightly as they moved across his body. So Mark's awareness sharpened, his senses focusing on her even as his body remained relaxed. There was something off, something that went beyond a simple massage. He could feel the charge in the air between them intensifying, like static building before a storm. Zara's touch, once precise and practiced, had become more erratic, more urgent. Her fingers dug deeper into his skin, and for a brief moment, Mark felt an actual spark jump between them. His eyes flew open, his body tensing again as the sensation jolted through him. He turned his head slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of Zara, but her face was shrouded in shadow. All he could see were the outlines of her form, the way her body seemed to shimmer faintly in the low light. Her breath came in shallow gasps now, and Mark could feel the heat radiating from her, like she was burning from within. His pulse quickened. Something was wrong, but before he could speak, before he could ask what was happening, Zara's hands stilled. For a moment, the room was completely silent, save for the sound of their breathing. Then, without a word, Zara stepped back, her presence retreating into the background once more. Mark lay still, his body buzzing with residual energy, his mind racing with questions. But the answers, it seemed, would have to wait. For now, all he knew was that this encounter, this woman, was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. And whatever was happening between them, it was far from over. Mark lay face down on the massage table, his body both relaxed and alert, a strange mix of tension still coiled within him. The soft glow of the room, the almost imperceptible hum of the atmospheric filtration system, and the faint scent of alien herbs all worked in concert to create an environment meant for deep relaxation. But something about this place, about Zara, stirred a different kind of awareness in him, something far more intense and electric. Zara's hands hovered above his back once more, barely an inch from his skin. For a moment, nothing happened. The air felt still, almost expectant, as if waiting for something to break the quiet tension that had settled in the room. Mark could feel the subtle energy of her presence, like static electricity building between them, charged and waiting to discharge. His senses, honed from years of military training and countless covert missions, were attuned to every change, every shift in the atmosphere. Then, slowly, Zara's hands began to descend, her fingers brushing lightly against the skin of his upper back. The touch was delicate, tentative at first, but even that faint contact sent a shiver through his spine. There was something different this time, something more than the physical sensation of her touch. It was as if an unseen force connected them, a current of energy that passed from her fingertips directly into his body. The Mark's muscles tightened involuntarily as the sensation spread across his skin, a subtle hum at first, like the gentle buzz of electricity. The fine hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, reacting to the invisible current that now coursed between them. Zara's fingers pressed deeper into his shoulders, and the hum grew stronger, more pronounced, radiating outwards from the points of contact. But his breathing quickened slightly, though he tried to maintain control. He had felt pain before, intense, searing pain in battle, the kind that breaks lesser men, but this was something different. This was neither pain nor pleasure, but an overwhelming sense of raw energy coursing through his body, lighting up every nerve in its path. Zara's hands moved with precision, kneading the tight muscles in his back, but each touch carried with it that strange electric charge. It was more than just physical, it was almost metaphysical, something he couldn't quite explain. The energy she was transferring into him was growing, and Mark could feel it spraying through his body like a slow, steady tide. His mind fought to stay grounded, to understand what was happening, but the intensity of the sensation was pulling him under, blurring the lines between his thoughts and the raw physicality of the moment. His body, still accustomed to the hyper-awareness of combat, began to react instinctively. Every muscle tensed, ready for action, as if preparing to defend against an unseen threat. Yet, despite this, a part of him welcomed the sensation, as if drawn to a primal force he didn't fully understand. His heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of what was happening. Zara's hands moved lower, working their way down his back, each touch sending another wave of that electric energy coursing through him. The sensation was growing stronger now, more concentrated, as if the very air around them had become charged with power. It wasn't just in his skin anymore, it was deeper, penetrating his muscles, his bones, making him feel like every part of his body was alive with an energy that was foreign and yet familiar. His senses heightened. Mark became acutely aware of Zara herself. Her breath, which had been calm and steady when she first began, was now shallow, quickened by the same force that was affecting him. He could feel her presence more acutely now, as though her energy was intertwining with his own, their bodies connected not just by touch but by something far more profound. There was a tension in the air, thick and palpable, almost as if the space around them was compressing under the weight of the connection. He could feel the faint tremor in her hands as they moved over his lower back, her fingertips grazing his skin in a way that sent another surge of energy through him, like a current running through his nerves. The spark between them was undeniable, growing with each passing second, as though some unseen force was pushing them closer to the edge of something neither of them fully understood. As Zara's hands reached the base of his spine, the electric charge that had been steadily building seemed to reach a crescendo. His entire body felt as though it was buzzing with energy, every muscle, every nerve, alive with sensation. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, an intense warmth that radiated outwards, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. The energy wasn't just around him now, it was inside him, coursing through his veins, filling him with a sense of power that both exhilarated and unnerved him. His breath came in short, controlled bursts, his chest rising and falling steadily as he tried to keep his composure. But it was becoming harder to maintain that control. The energy was overwhelming, too intense to ignore, and he could feel it building, gathering like a storm inside him, waiting for release. Zara's hands paused for a moment, hovering just above his lower back, as if she too was feeling the intensity of what was happening. Mark could sense her hesitation, the way her fingers trembled slightly in the air, unsure of how to proceed. Her breath, once so steady, was now shallow and rapid, and he could feel the heat of her body close to his, almost as though she was sharing in the energy that now crackled between them. Then, without warning, her hands pressed firmly against his skin once more, and the connection between them snapped into place like a live wire. So Mark's body jolted as the energy surged through him, more powerful than before, electrifying his entire being. It was like nothing he had ever felt, pure, unfiltered power, coursing through his veins, lighting up every nerve in his body. His muscles tensed involuntarily, his fist clenching against the table as the force of it overtook him. It was as if Zara had unlocked something deep within him, something that had been dormant until now. The energy was no longer just flowing into him, it was coming from within, pulsing outwards in waves, colliding with the energy that Zara was pouring into him. He could feel it growing, expanding, until it was too much to contain, threatening to overwhelm him. His mind raced, struggling to make sense of the sensation. This was no ordinary massage, this was something far more powerful, far more dangerous. The connection between them wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that transcended the boundaries of the body. He could feel it in his core, a primal force that bound them together, pulling them both into the same current of energy. Zara's breath hitched, and Mark could sense that she was feeling it too, the intensity of the connection, the raw power that was now coursing through both of them. Her hands, which had been steady and controlled at the beginning, now trembled against his skin, her movements less precise, more erratic. It was as though she too was being swept up in the current, losing control as the energy between them grew stronger, more volatile. His skin tingled wherever she touched him, as if sparks were dancing along his nerves. Every time her fingers pressed into his muscles, it felt like a jolt of electricity, sharp and exhilarating. He could feel the heat rising in his body, spreading from his core outwards, filling him with a sense of power and urgency that he couldn't fully explain. It was intoxicating, almost overwhelming in its intensity. But there was something else beneath the surface, something more than just a physical connection. He could feel it in the way the energy moved between them, ebbing and flowing like a tide, pulling them closer together. It wasn't just about touch anymore, it was about something deeper, something that connected them on a level that went beyond the body. Bear's hands moved once more, sliding over his skin, tracing the contours of his body, with a touch that was both delicate and charged with power. Every motion sent another surge of energy through him, and Mark could feel himself slipping further into the sensation, losing himself in the overwhelming intensity of it all. The energy between them continued to build, growing stronger with each passing second, until it felt like the air itself was vibrating with it. Mark could feel his control slipping, his mind growing hazy as the sensation overtook him. His muscles tensed and relaxed in rhythm with her touch, his body responding instinctively to the electric charge that now filled the room. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the moments blurring together as the energy surged between them. Mark could feel the raw power of it coursing through him, filling him with a sense of strength and vulnerability all at once. It was as if Zara had tapped into something deep within him, something he hadn't even known was there. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the energy seemed to shift, ebbing slightly, the current between them slowing to a more manageable level. Zara's hands stilled once more, her fingers resting lightly against his back, the trembling in her touch barely noticeable now. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the lingering energy of their connection, but the intensity had subsided, leaving behind only a quiet hum. Mark's breath came in shallow gasps as he lay there, his body still buzzing with the after effects of the connection. He could feel the tension slowly draining from his muscles, his heartbeat beginning to steady. Yet, even as the intensity faded, the connection between them remained, a subtle charge that still pulsed beneath the surface. Whatever had just happened between them, it had been more than a simple massage. It had been a meeting of energies, a collision of forces that neither of them had fully understood, but that had left a lasting mark on them both. And as Mark lay there, his body still tingling with the remnants of that electric connection, he knew that this encounter was far from over. Mark sat on the edge of the observation deck, looking out at the horizon where the sky met the sea of clouds below. The Elysium Haven Resort was suspended in the upper atmosphere, floating like a serene island in the middle of an endless ocean of mist. The stars were beginning to appear, pinpricks of light piercing the darkening sky, while a gentle breeze whispered across the platform, cool against his skin. The atmosphere was tranquil, yet the tension simmering beneath the surface of Mark's thoughts made the serenity feel almost ironic. He had agreed to meet Zara after their session earlier that day. The electric charge that had passed between them during the massage was still coursing through his body, leaving him feeling raw, exposed in ways he wasn't used to. He had come here to recover, to escape the intensity of his life as a covert operative, but now he found himself facing something even more unsettling, an unknown connection with someone who seemed to affect him on a level far deeper than the physical. The memory of her touch lingered on his skin, more than just sensation. It was like the energy she had drawn out of him still clung to him, alive in his muscles and bones. He didn't understand it. Mark was a man of logic, of action, and this, whatever it was, defied all of that. It felt primal, something ancient and untouchable, a force that couldn't be easily dismissed or rationalized. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoed behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. He didn't need to turn to know it was Zara. Her presence was unmistakable, like the gentle hum of electricity before a storm. She moved with a grace that seemed to carry no weight, her steps barely audible even in the stillness of the evening. Mark glanced over his shoulder as she approached, her violet skin gleaming faintly under the soft ambient lighting of the deck. She wore a simple, flowing dress that accentuated the smooth lines of her body, the fabric shifting and shimmering with every step. But it wasn't her appearance that held his attention, it was the way she seemed to carry the same charge that had passed between them earlier, as though the energy hadn't dissipated, but had only grown stronger. Zara stopped a few feet from him, her golden eyes meeting his with an intensity that mirrored the tension he felt in his own chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of something neither of them fully understood. Mark's pulse quickened, though he kept his outward composure, masking the tumult that stirred within him. Finally, she sat down beside him, her movements fluid and graceful, as though the very act of sitting down was part of a dance. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable, it was heavy with anticipation, like both of them were waiting for the other to make the first move. Mark could feel her presence beside him, so close that the warmth of her body seemed to blend with his, the invisible current between them humming just beneath the surface. He didn't know how to start this conversation. Words had always been tools for Mark, efficient, precise, meant to convey only what was necessary. But now, faced with this growing connection, the usual control he had over his thoughts and actions seemed to falter. How could he even begin to explain what had happened when he didn't fully understand it himself? Zara broke the silence first, though not with words. Instead, she simply extended her hand, letting her fingers hover just above his forearm. Mark tensed at the proximity, his skin prickling with awareness. She didn't touch him, but the sensation was undeniable, the same electric pulse he had felt earlier during the massage, the same strange energy that had flowed between them. He glanced down at her hand, then back up at her face. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes told a different story. There was curiosity there, yes, but also something deeper, a recognition, perhaps, of the connection they shared. It was as if she, too, was trying to make sense of what had passed between them, trying to understand why this energy, this bond, felt so significant. Mark took a slow breath, his mind racing to find the right words, to make sense of the chaos inside him. But nothing felt adequate. How could he explain what he was feeling when it defied explanation? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low and measured, barely more than a whisper against the quiet night air. What happened earlier, it wasn't just physical, was it? Zara's eyes flickered, her golden gaze locked on his. She didn't answer right away, but he could see the conflict in her expression, the same uncertainty, the same need to understand. She shook her head slowly, her hand still hovering just above his skin, close enough that he could feel the faint hum of her presence, the energy still alive between them. "No," she murmured softly, her voice like a breeze passing through the stillness. It wasn't. The simplicity of her response didn't surprise him, but it didn't offer him the answers he craved either. He had expected that. Whatever this was, whatever force had been set into motion between them, it wasn't something that could be easily explained with words. He felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly, though the intensity of their connection remained. Dar's hand lowered a fraction, her fingers brushing lightly against his forearm. The touch was brief, but it sent another jolt of that familiar energy through him, like a spark igniting a flame. Mark clenched his jaw, trying to suppress the surge of feeling that welled up inside him. It wasn't just desire, it was something deeper, something more primal, as though their connection transcended the usual boundaries of attraction or affection. It felt like their very energies were entwined, like they had been drawn together by forces beyond their control. Zara's gaze softened, her eyes flicking down to where her fingers brushed his skin. "I don't understand it either," she admitted, her voice low, almost apologetic. "But I've never felt anything like this before." Mark's pulse quickened at her words, though he didn't let it show. He wasn't sure if it was comforting or disconcerting that she was just as confused as he was. The control he usually prided himself on felt distant now, slipping further from his grasp with each passing second. He was a man of action, of precision. But this was something he couldn't fight or analyze. It was happening whether he wanted it to or not. Zara's hand moved again, this time resting more firmly on his arm, her touch sending another wave of energy through his body. He could feel it coursing through him, lighting up every nerve in his skin, making his heart race. It wasn't painful, but it was intense, like a current running through him, connecting them on a level that went beyond the physical. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing, to regain control. But the energy was too strong, too insistent. It pulsed between them, growing stronger with every second, like the air itself was charged with electricity. He could feel it in his bones, in his muscles, in the very core of his being. When he opened his eyes again, Zara was watching him closely, her gaze filled with a mix of curiosity and something else, something more intimate, more personal. It was as if she could see the effect this connection was having on him, as if she too was feeling the same pull. Mark swallowed, his throat dry. "What is this?" he asked quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was asking her or himself. Zara's eyes flicked downward for a moment, as though she was searching for an answer, something that could explain the inexplicable. But when she looked back at him, there was no resolution in her gaze, only the same uncertainty that he felt. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But I can feel it too." Her hand slid down his arm, resting against his wrist, and Mark felt the full weight of their connection in that moment. It wasn't just a physical touch, it was as if their very souls were reaching out to one another, drawn together by some unseen force. The energy between them pulsed stronger now, more insistent, and Mark could feel it pulling him in, drawing him closer to her. He exhaled slowly, trying to regain control of his thoughts, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The bond between them was growing, strengthening with every passing second, and Mark knew that whatever this was, it wasn't something he could walk away from easily. It was too powerful, too consuming. He turned to face Zara fully now, his eyes searching hers for some kind of answer, some hint of what they were experiencing. But all he saw was the same raw intensity that he felt, the same unspoken connection that had sparked between them during the massage, the same energy that now crackled in the air around them. And neither of them spoke. There were no words for what they were feeling. Instead, they sat there in silence, the bond between them deepening with each breath, each heartbeat. Mark could feel his own pulse in his throat, could hear the blood rushing in his ears, but none of it mattered now. The only thing that mattered was the connection between them, the invisible thread that bound them together. And as the stars twinkled above and the soft breeze carried the scent of alien flowers on the air, Mark knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever force had brought them together, it was far from finished. Their bond, strange and electric, was just beginning to unfold, and neither of them had any control over where it would lead. The night hung over Elysium Haven like a dark velvet shroud, the stars glittering against the expanse of the sky. So Mark paced the length of his suite, his movements slow and deliberate, but there was a palpable tension beneath each step, as though he were a predator caged within the luxury of his surroundings. He had spent his entire life preparing for great ones, were clear, direct enemies that could be fought neutralized. But what he was facing now was different, far more complex and elusive. Zara had left their earlier encounter on the observation deck without any definitive answers, and while their connection still buzzed in the back of his mind, there was a new shadow looming over the horizon. The energy between them had stirred something in him, something that went beyond attraction or desire. It was deeper, more primal, as if they were connected by forces far older than either of them could understand. But now, that feeling of connection was being overshadowed by something darker, a danger that wasn't merely physical, but was wrapped in layers of secrets and threats from a past Zara had barely alluded to. He had received the call just moments after returning to his suite. The message came encoded, a burst of encrypted data that his comm device immediately decoded with a soft chime. Mark's breath had stilled as soon as the words began to scroll across the small screen. Lazarus. Mark's eyes had narrowed, his entire body going rigid as the name appeared in the briefing. Lazarus, an alien hunter whose name was spoken only in the darkest corners of intergalactic underworlds, a being whose reputation was as deadly as it was mysterious. A predator who didn't just hunt his prey, he consumed them, using their life force, their energy, to fuel his own dark abilities. The Lazarus is infamous for hunting beings with unique and potent energy signatures, and if the briefing was correct, Zara was his latest target. The realization had hit him like a cold wave, cutting through the warmth of the connection he had felt with Zara. She was in danger, and it was more than just her alien biology that made her vulnerable. Lazarus wasn't after her because of a simple biological cycle. He was hunting her for her energy, the very force that had crackled between them during the massage, the same power that had made her so irresistible. Zara was powerful, far more than she had let on, and Lazarus wanted that power for himself. Mark's mind raced as he paced the suite, trying to formulate a plan. This wasn't just a random threat, it was a deliberate, calculated pursuit. And if Lazarus had set his sights on Zara, then the hunter would stop at nothing until he had her. Mark had dealt with threats like this before, covert operations against powerful beings with dangerous abilities, but Lazarus was a different kind of monster. He wasn't just an adversary, he was a predator that fed on the very essence of his victims, leaving them hollowed out and drained. Mark's thoughts snapped back to the present as he heard the soft hiss of the door opening. Zara stepped inside, her movements cautious, her violet skin almost luminous in the dim light of the suite. She didn't speak right away, but the tension in her body was unmistakable. She had felt it too, the danger that now loomed over them. So Mark met her gaze, his expression hard, focused. The time for quiet contemplation had passed. It was about survival. He took a step toward her, his voice low but steady. "We need to talk." Zara nodded, her golden eyes flickering with a mix of fear and something else, resignation perhaps. As she moved closer, footsteps almost soundless on the soft carpet, but her presence was as intense as ever, that same electric energy still pulsing between them, even now. Mark didn't waste time. He didn't need to explain who Lazarus was. Zara already knew. That much was clear from the look on her face. Instead, he asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the briefing. "How long have you known?" Zara exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping as if she were carrying the weight of something far heavier than she had let on before. She glanced away, her hands flexing at her sides as though she was searching for the right words. But when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost haunted. "Since before I came here," she admitted, her gaze shifting back to him. "I thought I could escape him, that if I stayed off the grid long enough, he wouldn't find me. But it was only a matter of time." Mark clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. This wasn't a situation he had walked into blindly. He had been trained to detect danger, to anticipate threats, but Lazarus was a predator who played by different rules. And Zara, with all her power and grace, had been running from him, hiding her true strength not just from Lazarus but from everyone. He took another step toward her, the tension between them crackling like the air before a storm. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Zara's eyes darkened, and she shook her head. "I didn't want to drag anyone else into this. Lazarus, he's not someone you fight. He's a force of nature, a nightmare that doesn't stop until he gets what he wants." Her words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He had faced impossible odds before, gone up against enemies that seemed unbeatable. But the way Zara spoke of Lazarus, the fear that laced her voice, it was different. This wasn't just another mission. This was personal. "He's after you because of your energy," Mark said, his voice hardening as he pieced it together. "That's why he's hunting you. You have something he wants." Zara nodded, her expression tightening. "My species, we have a heightened connection to energy fields. It's part of who we are, how we communicate, how we survive. But during certain cycles, it becomes more potent, and Lazarus knows that. Mark felt a chill run through him. He remembered the way her energy had felt when she touched him, the way it had pulsed through him during the massage. It had been powerful, intoxicating. He could see now why Lazarus was so desperate to claim her. Zara took a step closer, her voice softer now, almost pleading. I thought I could control it. I've spent years learning how to keep my energy contained, how to hide it. But when I'm in the middle of the cycle, it's harder. Her eyes met his, and Mark could see the fear in them, the fear of losing control, of becoming a target once again. But there was something else in her gaze, too, something deeper. She wasn't just afraid for herself. She was afraid for him. You don't have to face him alone, Mark said, his voice firm, resolute. I've dealt with threats like this before. I can help you. Zara looked at him, her expression torn between hope and despair. Mark, you don't understand. Lazarus doesn't just kill. He consumes. He drains the life out of people, takes their energy, and leaves them empty. You can't fight that. Mark's jaw clenched. He had heard stories of Lazarus, whispered rumors of his abilities, but he wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, especially not when someone he cared about was in danger. So we're not running, he said, his tone final. We stop him. Here, now. Oh. Zara shook her head, fear flashing in her eyes. You don't know what you're asking. Mark took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. I know exactly what I'm asking. You and I, we have a connection. We felt it during the massage. That energy is powerful. We can use that against him. Zara's gaze flickered with uncertainty, but there was also a spark of hope, however faint. She had been running for so long, hiding from Lazarus and the power he sought to take from her. But Mark was offering her something she hadn't had in years, a chance to fight back. Before she could respond, a sudden shift in the air made both of them freeze. The lights in the suite flickered for a brief moment, and Mark's senses went on high alert. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere was being distorted by some unseen force. Zara's breath caught, her eyes widening with realization. He's here. Mark's blood ran cold. The hunter had found them. Without a word, he moved to the control panel on the wall, activating the suite's advanced security protocols. The windows darkened, the door sealed shut with an audible click, and the soft hum of the energy shields activating filled the room. It wouldn't be enough to stop Lazarus, but it would buy them time. Zara moved closer to him, her body tense, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The fear was palpable, but beneath it, Mark could sense her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to run this time. The air grew thicker, more charged, as though reality itself was beginning to warp under the pressure of an immense, dark power. Mark could feel it now, the presence of Lazarus, a force that was closing in on them like a predator stalking its prey. It was as if the room had become a cage, and Lazarus was circling, waiting for the moment to strike. Mark turned to Zara, his eyes filled with determination. We fight him together. Zara nodded, her face pale but resolute. She extended her hand toward him, and Mark took it without hesitation. As soon as their hands touched, that familiar electric charge surged between them, stronger than ever before. Their energies combined, intertwining, building into something more powerful than either of them alone. The lights flickered again, and the air around them seemed to crackle with tension. They were no longer just two individuals facing a threat, they were something more, a force united by their bond, their shared energy. And together, they would face Lazarus head-on. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his muscles coiled with anticipation. The hunter was coming, but they were ready. The room seemed to darken as a low, chilling presence filled the air. Lazarus had arrived, and the final confrontation was about to begin. The room was thick with tension, the air itself seeming to vibrate with an unnatural energy as Mark and Zara stood side by side, their hands still connected, the electric pulse of their shared energy thrumming between them. The dim light of the suite flickered once more, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls, and in that moment, Mark could feel that Lazarus was closer than ever before. Every instinct in his body screamed danger, his muscles tightening, senses sharpening. But this was different from the typical threat he had faced on the battlefield. Lazarus wasn't just a physical adversary. He was a force of nature, a predator that consumed not with teeth or claws, but with something far more insidious, something unseen, something that fed on the very essence of life. So Mark's breath was steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. He had fought countless enemies, faced death more times than he cared to count, but this felt different. The room had become a battleground not of fists and bullets, but of energy and intent, of forces both known and unknown. And the only weapon Mark had now was the connection he shared with Zara, the strange electric bond that had formed between them, something he barely understood but could feel pulsing through his veins. Zara's grip on his hand tightened, and Mark glanced at her. Her face was pale, her violet skin almost translucent in the dim, flickering light, but her eyes were steady, focused. She knew what they were up against. More than that, she knew what Lazarus was capable of. Her breath came in shallow, controlled bursts, and though she was afraid, she was ready. They both were. The temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly, a chill creeping into the air that made the hairs on the back of Mark's neck stand on end. He could feel it now, the presence of Lazarus, pressing in on them from every corner of the room, as though the very shadows themselves were alive, shifting and swirling with malevolent intent. It was as if reality was being pulled taut, ready to snap at any moment, and Mark's muscles coiled in anticipation of the inevitable. The door to the suite didn't open, it dissolved. One moment it was there, the next it melted into the air like smoke being swept away by the wind. The sudden absence of the barrier left the room exposed, vulnerable, and in its place, a figure appeared, stepping out of the darkness with an eerie grace. Lazarus. He was tall, impossibly tall, his frame long and lean, his movements unnervingly fluid, as though he wasn't bound by the same physical laws as everyone else. His skin was deathly pale, almost alabaster, and his hair was as black as the void between the stars, flowing down his back in silken strands. But it was his eyes, black, bottomless, swirling with the dark energy that truly unsettled Mark. Those eyes were empty, devoid of any emotion save for one: hunger. Lazarus didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone communicated his intent, and Mark could feel it in his bones. The air between them was charged, heavy with the weight of the confrontation that was about to unfold. Lazarus' gaze flicked briefly to Zara, and Mark could feel the shift in the air as the alien hunter locked onto her. He wasn't just interested in her, he wanted her. Wanted the energy that coursed through her, the power she held within. The Mark's grip on Zara tightened, his body tensing in preparation for what was to come. He could feel her energy pulsing through him, mingling with his own, creating a strange harmony that seemed to amplify with every passing second. Together, they were stronger than they had been alone, and that strength was the only thing that stood between them and the predator who had come to claim them. Lazarus took a single step forward, and the entire room seemed to ripple in response, the walls bending and warping, as though they were nothing more than projections on a screen. Mark's vision blurred momentarily, his sense of space distorting, and he blinked hard, trying to steady himself. But it wasn't just his eyes. Lazarus was manipulating the very fabric of the space around them, bending reality to his will. The hunter extended one hand, long, slender fingers outstretched, and Mark felt a sudden, violent pull. It wasn't physical, there was no force tugging at his body, but it was something deeper, something that clawed at his very essence, trying to rip away the energy that Zara had poured into him. His breath hitched as the sensation grew stronger, like his life force was being siphoned away, pulled toward the dark vortex that was Lazarus. But Zara reacted first. Without warning, she lifted her free hand, palm outstretched toward Lazarus, and a surge of energy exploded from her, a blinding flash of violet light that illuminated the entire room. Glenark felt the force of it course through him as well, amplifying his own energy, his senses sharpening, grounding him in the moment. The pull of Lazarus' power weakened, faltering against the force of Zara's release, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of hesitation in the hunter's eyes. Zara's energy didn't stop, it continued to grow, radiating outward like a supernova. The Mark could feel the air around them crackling with power, the very fabric of reality trembling under the force of it. This wasn't just a defensive move. This was Zara's true strength, the raw, uncontained energy she had tried so hard to suppress. But Lazarus wasn't finished. Then with a snarl, the hunter lashed out, his own power surging in response to Zara's attack. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting as they lunged toward her, seeking to ensnare her, to drain the very life from her. Mark could feel the cold tendrils of Lazarus' energy creeping toward them, threatening to suffocate the light that Zara had unleashed. But Mark was ready. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The energy that Zara had poured into him, the electric connection they shared, it wasn't just hers anymore. It was theirs. And now, it was time to use it. He reached deep within himself, drawing on the connection between them, and felt the surge of power ignite in his core. It was like a storm building inside him, raw and untamed, but he didn't try to control it. He let it flow, let it expand, until it filled every inch of his being. And then, with a single, focused breath, he released it. The force of it was overwhelming, a shockwave of pure energy that collided with Lazarus' dark power, pushing back the shadows, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Mark felt the energy ripple out from him, joining with Zara's, until they were no longer two separate forces but one. The room shook with the force of it, the walls cracking, the lights shattering. But it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the battle raging between them and Lazarus. Lazarus staggered back, his black eyes widening in shock. For the first time, Mark saw something other than hunger in the hunter's gaze: fear. The predator had become the prey, but Lazarus wasn't done yet. "She!" With a final, desperate snarl, Lazarus lunged forward, his hands outstretched, dark tendrils of energy lashing out toward Zara. Mark's heart lurched, his instincts screaming at him to move, to protect her. But before he could react, Zara stepped forward, her body glowing with the radiant energy that had been building within her. She didn't need protection. She was the storm. With a single fluid motion, Zara unleashed everything. The energy that had been pulsing beneath her skin, the raw, electric power that had been growing between them, it all erupted in a blinding flash of light. The force of it was so intense, so pure, that it consumed everything in its path. Lazarus was caught in the heart of it. For a split second, Mark saw the hunter's form dissolve, his pale skin burning away, his black eyes wide with horror as the energy consumed him. And then, with a final scream, Lazarus was gone, obliterated by the force of Zara's power. The room fell silent. Mark stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling from the aftermath of the battle. High energy that had coursed through him moments before was fading now, leaving him feeling raw, exposed. But Zara still glowed, her body radiating with the soft, violet light of her power. As she looked exhausted, her face pale, but there was a quiet strength in her gaze, a strength that hadn't been there before. They had done it. Together they had defeated Lazarus. Mark exhaled slowly, the tension in his body finally releasing. He turned to Zara, his eyes searching hers for some sign that she was okay. As she met his gaze, her golden eyes softening as she gave him a small, weary smile. But before he could speak, before he could even begin to process what had just happened, Zara's legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed into his arms. Mark caught her just in time, holding her close as she sagged against him, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Zara," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't respond, her head resting against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. High energy that had once radiated from her was dimming now, fading like the last embers of a fire. But she was alive. She had survived. Mark held her close, his heart pounding in his chest as he cradled her in his arms. The battle was over, but the aftermath, the weight of what they had just faced, what they had just survived, was only beginning to settle in. Lazarus was gone, obliterated by their combined power, but the cost of that victory was still unknown. He looked down at Zara, her face peaceful in sleep, and felt a surge of protectiveness well up inside him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever consequences would come from this night, he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't leave her side. The storm had passed, but the bond they had forged, an electric connection that had saved them both, would endure.